Hello and welcome to Money Matters TV. My name is Michael Verrill and I'm the Vice President of Strategic Development for the Sharp Financial Group. We provide a system of integrated financial management to help founders and second-generation business owners maximize business value, increase cash flow, reduce tax liability, and transition their most valuable asset to long-term family wealth and future legacy. Welcome to our continuing discussion on growth stories, where we hear from entrepreneurs and advisors who share secrets and advice on what business owners need to know to grow. From time to time, information involving financial matters for health care, technology, and life sciences companies may be discussed on this show. Those discussions are not and should not be considered financial advice. You should always check with your financial advisor before entering into any financial transaction. I'm joined today by my co-host, Rhea Bears, Vice President with CBRE, a global real estate consulting firm. Ms. Bears spent the last 15 years focusing on research and consulting to help corporate occupiers of real estate. She leads the technology and media practice in Philadelphia, where she provides strategic real estate advice to high-growth technology companies to help with their business objectives. She also is involved with the Program Development and Outreach Committee for Tech Girls, an organization that exposes middle school age girls to careers in technology. Hello, Rhea, and welcome to Growth Stories.
Thanks, Mike. I'm glad to be here.
Before we get started, why don't you share a couple of projects that you're currently working on?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. I'd be happy to. One of the projects that we're working on is a platform that CBO acquired earlier this year called Floored. Floored was just named to the top 20 innovative tech companies to watch in 2018. And what Floored allows us to do is to take 2D plans of office space and convert them into 3D plans. So one of the projects that I'm working on now is with a life sciences company in the suburbs who has 2 offices that they would like to combine. We were able to identify a building that works very well for the commute analysis of their employees. And from that, we were able to take the space plan out where everyone would sit, and allow them with the click of a mouse to see the 3D model of that space plan. We could really integrate the finishes, carpets, ceiling tiles, all of the things that are very hard to envision as a CEO making a decision like this. And the really interesting thing that we're able to do is to also see your views from the windows of that space.
That's what everybody cares about, right? What do their views look like?
That's right.
That's exciting. That's great.
Thank you.
We have a question from one of our viewers before we get started, and I'd like to see if you could help me answer that. Martin Young from Philadelphia would like to know, are the real estate areas growing for the tech areas in the Philadelphia region?
Oh, sure. That's a great question. I would say that University City is really a high rental rate growth market and a lot of real estate development occurring. There's a great tacit knowledge cluster of tech talent there, and it's self-propagating. The other submarket that I would mention is what we're calling the Gold Coast of the suburbs, and it's the East Swedesford Market area, road area in King of Prussia. Companies that are looking for tech talent are being driven there because of the quality of real estate, as well as a good tax climate and that availability of labor.
Okay, great. Well, hopefully that was helpful, Martin. It's always great to hear from our viewers. To submit for a future show, here's how to send your questions to Money Matters TV.
You can have your questions answered on Money Matters. Please go to our website, money-matterstv.com. On our homepage, click on the banner from the right that says, Send us your questions. While you're on our website, you can find information about our host and guests, as well as show notes and links about this show and past shows. Money Matters is also available as a podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, so you can listen to Money Matters while you're on the go. That website address, again, is money, M-O-N-E-Y, matters, M-A-T-T-E-R-S, TV.com.
Welcome back. We are excited to introduce to you our guest today, Ted McLaughlin, who is the CEO of Sorb Systems. Once a college dropout, Ted embodies the entrepreneurial spirit of someone who was dissatisfied with the current state and always willing to bet on himself. Ted, welcome. Rhea and I are happy to have you here as our
Great
guest
to be here.
today.
Thank you.
Very excited. Before we get into your background, I was wondering if you could give us a brief overview of Sorb and what the company does.
Sure. Our core business, we manufacture liquid medical waste solidifiers that are primarily used in hospital operating rooms. And another side of our business is we are a distributor of medical products and devices for a number of companies from like Cardinal Health, Umano Medical, Span America, and a number of other companies, primarily in the federal market space.
Great, great.
Thanks, Ted. So as Mike mentioned, you were at one point a college dropout. Can you give us a little bit of background of your upbringing and kind of the pivotal moment that drove you to becoming an entrepreneur?
Sure. I grew up in Syracuse, New York. I did attend Lemoyne College in Syracuse for a few weeks right out of high school before I was asked to leave. I never even took a test. I think I was probably the first person. I was there for a very short period of time.
Just like a long vacation.
Yeah, exactly. But then I transitioned to working for about a year or so, and subsequently, as you'll hear, I decided to join the Navy, and that was a very important decision on my entrepreneurial journey. It was probably the first major decision I ever made in my life, and I think that made it easier for me to make other bold decisions in my life. But I always wanted to be an entrepreneur. When I was a little kid, my brothers and I we all went to the same school along with my sister, and when they ran a fundraising campaign, I was the brother that sold everything for everybody and really enjoyed it. I've been working since I was about 10, cutting grass and delivering newspapers and lifeguarding and doing all that stuff.
Whatever you could do to make a buck, right?
Always, my whole life
Hustling.
since I was a little kid.
That's great.
Haven't changed.
That's great. We see that as a common trait of very successful entrepreneurs, right? Always
Absolutely.
willing to, take the initiative for yourself. Right. So, the dropping out of college 3 weeks into it, right? Kind of starting over. But that wasn't the only time you kind of went your own way. You talked about having initiative, but you came from a big swimming family, but you'd swam for a number of years and you weren't going to follow the kind of the company track, if you will. So
Right. So I had two brothers and a sister. We all swam. I started swimming competitively when I was about 6. I think by the time I was about 13, I was completely burnt out. I just got tired of following the black line and couldn't do it any longer. Tried playing basketball for a couple of years and just didn't work out because I hadn't played enough in my youth.
Right.
When I was about 15, my older brother came home from Notre Dame on a school vacation, and his friends were playing water polo at Syracuse University. So he took me along to a couple practices, and I fell in love with the sport and just started playing. And it was great because the first couple of years I played water polo, I was 15, 16 years old, and I was playing against these much older players, college level. It wasn't until a couple years later when I started playing against kids my own age that I really saw the benefit of having played with these older people for so long.
Right.
When I got to the national level, playing against people my own age, I did very well.
Yeah, you made the junior national team, correct?
I did. I made the junior national team. I worked out a couple summers at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado. I used to play summer league water polo at Cal Berkeley. Really enjoyed it. Love the sport.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Which is why my kids now play.
Yeah, yeah.
That's fantastic.
So.
So after your break from the initial college outing, you were ready to head back to college and play water polo. Is that right?
Yes. In the fall of 1982, my second freshman year in college, I went to Slippery Rock State College and spent a year there, kind of working out and playing water polo and partying. Didn't get a whole lot out of it academically, to say the least. The following summer, I went back to Cal Berkeley, and being around the Berkeley students was eye-opening to me. All of a sudden, a light bulb went off that these kids are going places, and I'm really not. And I need to make a change. And that's when I really kind of took the reins of my life and moved on.
And so what was that? What was that decision after that?
It's funny. So on the plane ride back from Berkeley to Syracuse, it was in early August of the summer of '83. I decided that I was not going to return to college. I was going to go drop out, join the Navy, and that's what I did. But the next day, the day after I arrived home, I went to a recruiting station, met with a recruiter. I don't think it was 3 weeks between that first meeting and when all the paperwork was done and I was scheduled to go to boot camp.
Right.
And I was excited to do it.
How were your parents? Were they supportive? Were they shocked? I mean,
you know, it's funny because I
kind of have obviously thinking maybe Ted doesn't have the best direction going on here, right?
They knew that.
Yeah.
But they rarely supported the idea. My father was a highly decorated veteran in Korea.
Oh, great. Okay.
So he always remained active in various veterans organizations. So he was 100% behind me the entire way. My mother was a little bit less convinced it was the right move, but I had already made the decision to sign the paper, so it was I wasn't looking for input. Yeah. The fact that they supported me was important, and I liked that. But I was going,
right?
And it was probably up to that point. It was clearly the biggest decision I ever made, and it was, in retrospect, the best decision. One of the best decisions I've ever made. Most
pivotal, right? I mean, it kind of sets you on your career path and everything else.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how long were you in the armed forces?
4 years.
4 years. Mm-hmm. And what was your experience like when you were in?
It was great. Mm-hmm. The military is very good at kind of breaking you down and rebuilding you into the right type of person. When I was 20 years old, I was a Navy search and rescue diver. Mm-hmm. I had a top secret security clearance. I worked around nuclear weapons. I did a lot of things that most people will never do. Went places a lot of people would never go, and really enjoyed the experience. But there was the leadership that they instilled and the responsibility. I don't think you can get that anywhere else. Right. The military is a different type of organization, and you can't really appreciate it unless you're in it. So it was great. I needed it.
Right. So you got the results that you were looking for.
Absolutely.
How did you end up getting out? You're there for 4 years, and then you get out. How did you talk about that?
So as I mentioned, I was a search and rescue diver. I injured my back, so I received a disability separation from the Navy in the spring of 1987. Mm-hmm. Not knowing, about a year earlier, I wasn't sure. I was due to, in 1987, that was my re-update or get out date anyway in September. I wasn't sure if I was going to stay in or get out anyway. So in early 1986, I reached out to the water polo coach at Villanova, who I had known from my water polo days, and asked him if he could give me a hand get it into Villanova in case that's the route that I decided to go. And he really did help me out. Very nice guy. His name was Dan Sheridan, and I'm thankful for the assistance that he gave me.
That's great.
So fortunately, I was accepted at Villanova, which was kind of impressive given my previous college experience.
Right. But I think you mentioned we were talking earlier that, I mean, obviously it was mostly based on your military experience.
No question about it. In fact, two things I had to do to get in. I had to take my SATs again. Mm-hmm. And the funny thing was, I took my SATs on my Navy ship on the way to the battle in Libya with Gaddafi in 1986.
No kidding.
And it was at like 3 o'clock in the morning. I had to have my division officer proctor the exam because I had to take it at the same time everyone in the States was taking the test.
Right.
So I did that, and then, great, and I just did well on the SAT. And when I filled out the application for Villanova, on the essay portion, it said in the space provided. So it was about a 2-page essay that I filled out. And the admissions officer wrote me a letter back and said, take as much space as you want and tell us about what you really do. So I wrote 8 or 9 page letter.
Oh, no kidding.
And and I was accepted. So
Did
it had
you
to be
share
the
with
service.
them that you were taking the SAT on the way to?
Didn't mention that, but I
Yeah.
mentioned a lot of things that I had done in the service, and
that's great.
And it worked. Very fortunate that I was accepted.
Well, it's interesting, and when they look at incoming freshmen, right? Somebody who spent 4 years in the military, I think there's some proven track record there. Whereas like a kid coming out of high school, you can look at the grades and the activities, but at the end of the day, given that independence and pressure of college, who knows how they'll succeed? But I guess they were fairly confident based on your background.
You're absolutely correct. And at 24, when you enroll as a full-time freshman, you got to be serious.
Yeah.
So, and I was serious.
Yeah, talk about that, because you really made a commitment this time around after having not been a great student in school and then having the starts and stops with college.
As I mentioned, my whole life I had always been a very average BC student until I got to Villanova. And when I got to Villanova, I knew it was my last shot. It was the third time around.
Right.
But I loved it. I loved the experience. And I did well there. I made Dean's List a number of semesters and Honor Society. I had these academic honors I had never, didn't know they existed before, quite honestly.
Right.
I was
Some
like,
of us
that's nice.
completely new. Yeah, that's great.
But more importantly, I really developed my critical thinking at Villanova. And that was great. That was, besides the Navy, going to Villanova was another incredibly important part of my life. I'm still very active at the university. I love Villanova. I'm thrilled to be an alum.
Exciting time to be an alumni at Villanova too, with the basketball program.
Yeah.
I know, it's
That's
a great
right.
time to be a Villanova. Never been a better time to be a Villanova alum.
Yes.
But yeah, so it was a fantastic experience, and that would also very much helped me on my entrepreneurial journey, because after I left Villanova, I went to work for a company called Baxter Healthcare,
Yeah.
a very big player back in the 90s in healthcare.
Okay.
Not having that degree from Villanova, I never would have got the job. So the pieces kind of fell into place. I didn't see it happening in front of me right at the time, but it all worked out.
Right.
And talk to us a little bit about your experience at Baxter, because I think in our previous conversation you were mentioning that the corporate environment didn't end up being for you.
That's true. And I think most entrepreneurs would have a difficult time working for a large corporation. It's just the nature of who we are. Entrepreneurs have a little bit different personality. I think there's no question about that. But I started at Villanova in early 90s. Here in Philadelphia, I had a territory that was handed to me. It was a very underperforming territory.
Okay.
And it was also a difficult time in healthcare. It was during the kind of the Hillary Care days, and there was a bit of a recession going on, and it was a challenging time. So I picked up this territory. It was doing a little less than $3 million a year, and when I left about 3 years later, it was doing over $7 million. So I looked at this tremendous growth, and the reality was it really didn't matter. It didn't mean much to me in terms of my income, and that kind of bothered me.
Yeah.
So that was one concern. I loved working there, and still have friends that are still there. They're now subsequently with Cardinal Health. But the other challenge I had with Baxter was just the corporate culture. And I just, like a lot of entrepreneurs, I just don't have the personality to play the corporate politics.
Right.
And
Even after having been through the Navy, which I'm sure you have.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. You would think you would, I would be better attuned to it, but I had that entrepreneurial personality, and not only didn't I have the personality to play the corporate politics, which, when you work for a large corporation, you know how important that is. That's
right.
half the game. I really didn't have the desire to learn.
Yeah. Compensation plays a big role in that too. I mean, how companies compensate those folks that are on the front lines. I mean, you're doing all the hard work, you're taking the risk.
Yep.
And the reward.
Yeah. So
isn't
between the
necessarily
compensation and
there.
the corporate culture that
Right.
it just wasn't quite for me. As much as I loved working there, it wasn't that difficult a decision to leave.
So you decide you're going to depart Baxter, but you don't jump right into your own company at that point. You try a smaller company, maybe seeing if that fits you. Is that?
Yes. I started working for a company called Advanced Medical Systems in Horsham. A medical supply distributor like Baxter, but a fraction of the scale, where Baxter was doing many billions in revenue back in the day. Advanced Medical was doing about 20 million.
Okay.
But the benefit to me was I got a much better understanding of how to run a small distributorship, run that type of a business. And my whole life I had always been looking for an opportunity to start a business. I always wanted my own business from when I was a little kid. So an opportunity presented itself one day, and I took advantage of it. And I started my first business called Select Medical Systems, selling used medical equipment, and did that for a couple of years before I started Sorb Systems.
That's an interesting story about how that came to be. Tell us a little bit about that, because that's a little entrepreneurial, the situation you created to kind of take that first stab at something.
Yeah, so that was the company Advanced Medical Systems. Among the other products they distributed, they sold IV pumps. So I had a hospital here in Philadelphia that needed new IV pumps. And IV pumps are typically a very long sales cycle. Because this hospital was desperate, we were able to close the deal in about 90 days. So we sold them I think it was about 110 IV pumps. And the irony was, I think my commission on those 110 pumps from Advanced Medical was about $8,000. The side deal that I worked at with the CEO of that hospital was they owed $15,000 on their old pumps. So I said, all right, I'll give you a check for the $15,000, me personally, not the company I work for, and I like those pumps. He said, no problem. You get us in the new pumps,
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Take these old pumps off.
Yeah, he was happy.
Right?
Exactly.
Show up with your U-Haul.
Yeah, so I literally showed up with a U-Haul truck a couple weeks after we in-serviced the new pumps. I handed over a check to the hospital for $15,000. I loaded up all these pumps in the truck and took them over to Graduate Hospital, where I knew the gentleman that worked in the loading dock back in the day. I had a buyer lined up. Buyer walked in, counted up the pumps, handed me a check. I made $42,000 clear in about 2 hours. And then the next week I had a very similar deal set up with ventilators, and I made about $100,000. So I made about $150,000 clear in my first 2 weeks in business.
Right.
Seed
And
capital.
exactly, which is what I needed. So I had that money to start Select Medical Systems, and
That's great.
And so, talked about the start in that. I think it's always interesting. They have the HP, the garage, right? But what was your garage setting? Where did you?
Yeah, so back
start?
in the day, I lived in a townhouse. So it was kind of funny because the community with 150 homes, and when I would do a deal, I never held the inventory. I had a lot of contacts in hospitals, and I would go out to a hospital and get a purchase order for 50 or 100 IV pumps or some whatever, and then I would go source those refurbished pieces of equipment. Back in the day, it was pretty innovative. Now you couldn't do it. There's too much competition on the internet, but there was no internet to compete with back in the day. So, but it was funny. We regularly had 18-wheelers pulling into my HOA development, and I would go out there and unload them.
Right.
And when my wife got home from work, we would have these pieces of equipment in our dining room, and we would put Select Medical Systems labels on the pumps or whatever they happened to be, and box them back up and ship them right back out.
That's great.
But it was a great
So how long
business.
did you do that for? How long?
I was in that business for about 2 years.
Okay.
Pretty soon after I started that business, my neighbor at the time was an Australian gentleman, and a friend of his was the business development officer at the Australian Embassy down in Washington. So when Australian companies wanted to sell products in the U.S., they would send information and samples to the business development officer, who would turn around and send those samples to his contacts, like my neighbor. So my neighbor had been showing me medical products for about a year. He probably showed me a half a dozen or so, and for various reasons, lack of reimbursement or whatever, I decided not to sell those products. Until one day he showed me a superabsorbent polymer that solidifies the liquid waste that's inside a hospital suction canister. And it was serendipitous, because when I was at Baxter, I was in corporate sales. I didn't sell any products. But for some reason, some years before, I had gone through a sales training session on superabsorbent polymer, so I knew what the technology was supposed to do. This was a much better technology, so I ended up negotiating U.S. and Canadian distribution rights, which was a challenge because that Australian company was talking to Baxter at the time. And I'm in the basement of my townhouse still, by myself, with a really nice phone system. And but I did secure U.S. and Canadian distribution rights. And it took about 2 years to get that product to market, but we got the product to market in 2001.
Okay. And so you're off and running with Sorb at that point, or where do you?
Yeah, so we're off and running. I did not have a factory, as I mentioned, and I didn't want to buy one because I didn't want the exposure, which is an important risk element when you're an entrepreneur.
Sure.
You've got to control risk, and people think that generally that entrepreneurs are these extreme risk takers, and while I'll agree that they're risk takers, I don't agree that they're not extreme for the most part. The risks that entrepreneurs take are very calculated, and they tend not to, like myself, not to pull the trigger until they are highly confident things are going to go their way. Now, things don't always go your way. I mean, as you well know,
absolutely.
it's,
You
can
have to
have
be
all
willing
the,
to suffer through some of those failures.
all those dominoes can be lined up, but something happens and something goes sideways and it doesn't work out, and that's just the way it is. But for the most part, they're very controlled risks. So early on, I didn't want to buy a factory because if the product didn't sell, I have a factory with nothing to do and I'd go bankrupt. So I used a toll manufacturing company down in Texas. They did all my blending and bottling and distribution. About a year and a half later, while we were building the business on the distributor side, the distribution side, the U.S. Department of Transportation passed a regulation requiring liquid medical waste to be solidified, which unfortunately I had nothing to do with the legislation, but the business took off.
Right.
Yeah, it was a home
And that's
run.
when I bought my first factory.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
So tell us a little bit about where you are today with it. That's kind of that was a catalyst to get you going, but the business has grown significantly and gone in I won't say entirely new direction, but certainly explored a new avenue for revenue and growth.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about
So in 2014, I decided that I wanted to go after the federal government market. I'm a service-disabled veteran, and I had the pieces to do that, but I didn't have the knowledge. Yeah. And selling in the government space is completely different than the private sector, and you almost can't figure it out yourself. So through a buddy of mine from my American Legion post, I met a gentleman who'd been a government contracting agent for about 20 years. He's a genius at government contracting, and we got together and he looked at what we had, or what I had at that time. He's now the president of my company. I started out as a consultant for about 6 months, and
it's cheaper to
thereafter,
pay him as the president.
yeah. And I wanted him full time.
Right.
So to make a long story short, in a relatively short period of time, we got the business service disabled vet certified. We received a federal supply schedule contract with the Veterans Administration. We got the business hub zone certified, which is SBA program. It's a historically underutilized business zone. We received a DAPA, a distribution and pricing agreement from the Department of Defense, and we were then off to the races, kind of.
Wow. So, I mean, obviously it's a successful growth story. You've had some bumps along the way, but is there any advice that you could offer to entrepreneurs, either as they're growing their business or just starting out, that you've learned that you'd want to share?
Sure. One of the most important things I've learned, and all successful entrepreneurs know this, is you have to have the right people. The people are the lifeblood of the company. And if you have the right people in the right seats on the bus, you'll be destined for success, much more so than if you don't have the right people. When I went through that phase too, that was very important. That's critical. We went through an ISO 9001 certification recently, and that made an amazing difference for our business. Changed the way we do business, really tightened up how we operate. Yeah. And one other thing, if I think many people and business owners don't realize how big the federal market space really is. The federal government buys about pretty much every product and service you can imagine. They're the largest customer in the world, and they always pay on time. Yeah. And those are good customers to have.
Tapping into a market like that can be huge.
Yes.
Well, time flies, Ted. This has been great. I feel like we could have a whole nother segment just continuing to talk about the business. And I know you do work to support veterans. Love to hear about that another time as well. Thank you very much, Rhea, for joining me as a co-host today. I would like to let you know that the next guest for Money Matters TV will be Lorna Velourdi of Environmental Strategy Consultants. As a reminder, you can download podcasts from iTunes and Stitcher, as well as see us on our YouTube channel, Money Matters TV. Thank you for joining us.